Hi, everyone. Welcome to Breaking the Silence podcast, produced by Angels Protection Inc., where we uplift the voices of young women and mothers and the advocates, researchers, and leaders shaping the systems that impact their lives. I'm your host, Makaila Davis, founder and chairwoman of Angels Protection Inc. And in our new series, She Protects the Planet, we center the critical connection between environments we live in, the health outcomes we experience, and in this series, amplifies voices working at the intersection of environmental science, public health, policy, and justice. Voices that remind us that where we live, breathe, and grow profoundly shapes our well being. Today's featured guest is a scientist and advocate who bridges research, policy, and community impact. With a deep commitment to ensuring that the communities are most affected by environmental harm are not left out of this conversation. So I just want to take a chance to introduce our guest, Rose Albert. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Pennsylvania, whose research focuses on social and environmental determinants of respiratory health, with particular attention to sex differences in lung development and the role of policy interventions in advancing environmental justice. She's also alumna of the University of Alabama at Birmingham, where she earned both a Bachelor's of Science in Chemistry and a Master's of Public Health and Environmental Health Sciences. It was during her time in Alabama that Rose's community and nonprofit experiences in public health policy, environmental leadership, and social justice advocacy, it deepened her commitment to Southern environmental justice. Her whole career is clear and powerful to provide scientific and policy support to communities most impacted by climate crisis, particularly those in the Deep South, where environmental exposures, structural inequities, and health disparities often intersect. Beyond her research, Rose is an active leader in science policy. She serves as vice president of Penn Science Policy and Diplomacy Group and is a founding member of the Scientist Network for Advancing Policy, where she works to translate science into action and inform equitable decision making. Committed to advancing equity and inclusion in STEM, Rose also volunteers with mentoring and outreach initiatives, including Project Short, Deep in Penn, STEM, and Farm for Good, supporting the next generation of scientists and public health leaders. Across every role, researcher, advocate, and mentor, and policy leader, Rose brings rigor, compassion, and purpose to her work. So I just want to say thank you so much for being a part of the podcast today, Rose.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
So also I want to just touch on too, she is an amazing powerhouse woman when it comes to environmental health. Okay. Also talking about like the work that she's doing in the deep south, but also up here in Pennsylvania. So I kind of just want to like start this conversation off with to begin, what first sparked your interest in environmental health and respiratory science?
Yes. So I grew up in Mississippi. I went to high school in Tennessee. I went to college in Alabama. And it wasn't until I went to college at the University of Alabama at Birmingham that I really felt a stronger commitment to my relationship with the South and also my commitment to environmental justice. So when I went into college, I was really interested between the interplay between the environment and human health. And initially, I thought the only way I could do that was by becoming a physician. And so I was aggressively pre-med my first year of college. And I thought that I wanted to become a physician who treated people who experience diseases as a result of their environmental exposure, so things like air pollution. During my time in college, I realized that I wasn't actually interested in diagnosing or treating anyone, and I was actually more interested in a lot of those more structural determinants of health that were shaping the contexts that these problems existed. So I realized I didn't necessarily want to be the physician that was treating the patient. I wanted to understand what was making these people sick to begin with. And the initiating event for that was I was an intern at a grassroots nonprofit called the Greater Birmingham Alliance to Stop Pollution. And they were working with a community that was living fence line to a major industrial facility, and it was called a Superfund site. And this community had experienced compounded injustices. So we call those cumulative exposures, where a lot of times when people think about environmental justice, they think about the smokestacks, they think about the pollution being dumped in rivers, which are absolutely environmental injustices, and they're examples of contaminants that often disproportionately impact low-income communities of color. But something that's sometimes overlooked in environmental justice are the confluence of other exposures that make it harder to be healthy. So things like lack of access to safe sidewalks or affordable grocery stores, or feeling safe and having green spaces that you can access. Um, so all of these things were very evident in North Birmingham, Alabama, where this is a historically redlined community. So there were a lot of racial zoning laws that were very exclusionary that had led to these health outcomes. Um, but where I'm going with this is the community was concerned about the industrial facility and the air pollution that was being emitted from that. And so I was working with the community and with this nonprofit to monitor the pollution that was coming from the facility. And so through this, I was able to learn one about a lot of the lived experiences about the communities that were living here. So a lot of those concerns that I just mentioned. So not just the air tastes crunchy or I can see the haze every time I drive to work, but also a lot of other aspects of the roofing on their houses were falling apart and they needed to be replaced, or not having access to safe sidewalks or living in a flood zone. So learning about what these cumulative exposures were and also stepping outside of the lab and seeing how science could be used as a tool for social justice and how community concerns needed to guide research priorities. So all of this to say, I learned from this experience how community knowledge and community expertise needed to guide the research that's conducted. And also, I recognized that I was really interested in gaining more expertise to provide scientific support to these communities who needed policy advocacy.
No, I love that. And I loved how you tie it all into policy and advocacy. Because I think sometimes too, when we're doing our research, folks are not thinking about that part of it and how that really plays a part like into environmental justice. Um, so like also too, like I'm going to touch on your academic journey. It began in the Deep South and has brought you to the University of Pennsylvania. So how did your experiences in Alabama shape your commitment to environmental justice?
I would say that living in growing up in the Deep South, I thought that I wanted to leave and I was ready to go to school far, far away and never come back. And I realized that a lot of the experiences that I had in the Deep South were tied by common systems of oppression. And so a lot of the ways that people perceive the South, as some people perceive it as being very regressive or being this horrible damned place that no one should ever live in. And a lot of times when we perpetuate these negative stereotypes about a place, we're only working against the people who are making progress. And so, yes, when I was growing up in Mississippi, I didn't think, oh, this is amazing. I'm having a great time. But I also realized that by perpetuating these negative stereotypes about the Deep South, I was also leading to a lot of erasure of a lot of civil rights organizing or a lot of social justice histories that do exist in the Deep South. And I think a lot of people overlook the fact that it is a radical place if you know where to look. Um, so I think being in Alabama, that really changed my relationship with the South by learning from and working with these Deep South organizers and these luminaries who had already been advocating and organizing for social change. So I did um, I did move to the Northeast for graduate school, and I've really enjoyed being in Philadelphia. And also, I recognize that in the long haul of my career, I would like to go back to working with Southern environmental issues.
No, I love that. What I'm hearing is that like some of those experiences that you had growing up, you thought like, oh my gosh, like this was not it. But then as like time progressed, you're like, you know what? Let me gain this knowledge so then I can go back home and be able to help and translate that into policy.
Yes.
So no, I really love that. And that kind of like touches into too. So you study sex differences in lung development. So why is it important for environmental health research to account for biological and social differences across populations?
Yes. So when I came into graduate school, I was primarily interested in learning about the lung. And I knew that whatever skills that I could gain as a scientist, as an investigator, I could apply eventually back to inhalation toxicology, which is my long-term goal. So I'm interested in understanding how what we breathe ultimately impacts our health. And that can be things like air pollution, it can be things like pollen, it can be things like drugs and pharmaceuticals. So, for example, people who take an inhaler. And when I joined my lab, I was primarily looking for someone who would support what those goals are for both research and for policy. And it just so happened that I ended up in a sex differences lab. And at the time, I had no clue what that meant. I vaguely knew that whenever people did research, you're supposed to look at both men and women, or you're supposed to use both male and female mice. But I didn't know that sex differences in itself was its own line of research. And it ended up being something that is really of interest, huge interest to me right now. And I think right now in the political climate, we can see how important it is for people to be in this area of research, especially because, women have been so understudied for so long. And it's important that we consider these factors to make the best health outcomes for everyone. And so before I continue, let me clarify a couple of terms. So a lot of times we conflate both sex and gender. So whenever we are thinking about research, it's important that we're recognizing that gender is a social construct. And so that doesn't always align with what we perceive as being biological sex that it would correspond to. So whenever we're thinking about sex, we think about often of male and female, but it's not just these two categories because we know that there are so many factors that go into sex as a biological variable. So sometimes people can perceive that as being external genitalia. So testes versus ovaries, different reproductive organs. We also know that hormones are a factor, so things like estrogen and testosterone, but automatically assuming that someone who is female will have certain types of hormone levels or certain reproductive organs isn't always the most accurate. We know that, for example, some people who are maybe labeled as being biologically female don't have a uterus if they have a hysterectomy. We know that things like hormone levels can change throughout the life course. So something that is of huge interest right now in sex differences research is being as precise as possible about what those variables we're discussing are. So just because we're studying the role of estrogen in a disease doesn't automatically equate to being a sex difference in itself. So for example, my research is focused on sex chromosomes. So I study chromosomes X and Y, and we know that XX chromosomes, which are often labeled as being the female chromosome complement, those aren't the only option, so to speak. So it's not always just XX and XY. We know there are some people with more than one X chromosome. We know that there are some people with one X chromosome. We know there are people with things like Jacob syndrome or Turner syndrome. So all of this to say, biological sex doesn't fit neatly into these two categories that a lot of people perceive. And then biological sex is also a different set of categories than gender. Um, so to answer your question, though, why is it important that we think about these things in an environmental context is the fact that all of those factors that I just described of the reproductive organs that you may have, your hormone levels, the chromosomes that you have, the way also gender can influence your environmental exposures in terms of what you're exposed to. If you think about occupations, so people who maybe work in certain types of jobs, or also the types of products that we use, so personal care products. All of these factors influence what we're exposed to and possibly what our biological response might be to it. Um, so to answer your question, I study the role of sex chromosomes in hyperoxia exposure. So when babies are born prematurely, their lungs are still underdeveloped. And so they require extra oxygen in order to survive in the NICU or the neonatal intensive care unit. And so what my lab is studying is how the biological sex of that infant may be contributing to the different outcomes that they may have, because the disease that we study, we know impacts primarily male infants. Um, so I'm not sure if that quite answered your question. I feel like that was a little bit of a tangent about a lot of different variables, but I'm happy to go more in depth if there was a specific area of that you had questions about.
No, I think that was great. I think that really touched on like why you went into that specific study and how you got there. And I think it's really important that there is representation. I think sometimes we don't realize like when we're given an opportunity for something different. And like I would have never known about this if somebody did not just throw you into that lab that day, and for all the listeners, yeah, all the viewers and listeners that are watching, I know that they have more or less or likely have not heard about it. Um, and I think it's really like I think to me it's really impactful and wonderful that this is the work that you're doing and what you're deciding to do long term. Um, and just like it's just really critical that there is more representation in this specific niche because to me it's a niche. Not many
Yeah.
folks are doing it. Um, so like also too like environmental exposures are disproportionately impacted in certain communities, as we know. So
Yes.
how do social and environmental determinants of health show up in respiratory outcomes?
Absolutely. We know that race is the primary predictor for a lot of exposures that people experience. This is due to environmental racism, exclusionary zoning practices. We know that this this is just demonstrated fact that they're more likely to be exposed. People, low wealth communities of color are more likely to expose to a variety of environmental hazards, and there needs to be concerted efforts in order to create better policies to protect them. This is due to proximity to these facilities themselves. And so that is why there is a need to study ways that we can reduce exposures through regulation of those industries.
Definitely. And so what I'm hearing is that there needs to be a lot of more policy work put in place to kind of reduce a lot of those like unfortunate events that are happening in low incomes
Yes.
communities. And then also too, so like air quality, pollution, and climate change, they're often discussed. Abstractly, I would kind of say, so how do you see these issues manifest in everyday lives of families and children?
Of environmental justice and climate justice.
For like air quality, pollution, climate change.
Yes. So I will preface this as someone who had the privilege of learning about this rather than through my own lived experience. So I will preface this is primarily from what I've learned from other communities who are facing this. But I think that it's a lot of not only the immediate exposures of air pollution, but I think also the cumulative impacts of living fence line to these facilities. So a lot of the things that I mentioned of having access to healthy grocery stores or having access to sidewalks or parks or green spaces, having access to good paying jobs, things, safe schools for your children. Um, so I think a lot of people will sometimes talk about climate change in the future tense of like, oh, well, when climate change gets here. But talking about it in that tense is really such a privilege because there are people who live in flood zones who every time there's a stormwater event, they're concerned about their if their home is going to flood or maybe their roof, the quality of their housing. So I think recognizing that all of these other sectors do intersect with climate. So things like housing, things like labor, things like healthcare access. So for example, if you have a medication that needs to be refrigerated and you know that there's possibility of a power outage, like that is a climate justice concern. Um, so I think recognizing that climate and environmental justice intersects with so many different types of quality of life rather than just the immediate contaminant itself, which itself is a huge concern, especially for immediate and long-term health outcomes.
Right. No, I love that you touched on that, especially the immediate and long-term outcomes for communities. I feel like that's like really critical, important. And then like also too, it kind of segues into my next question. Why is the Deep South particularly vulnerable to environmental and respiratory health challenges? And what does justice-focused intervention look like there?
Mm. So there are a variety of reasons that the South has these patterns of inequity. I think there's been long-term divestment from the South. There's also something that's been coined by Dorceta Taylor as being internal colonialism, where a lot of the negative externalities from other communities are exported to the South. And so they have to carry a lot of those different industries. So, for example, having a disproportionate number of waste sites or waste processing facilities, having a disproportionate number of I guess like dirty industries. So if you look at places like the Louisiana Cancer Corridor, and there are a variety of petrochemical facilities that are sited in one very concentrated area, that's not a coincidence. And I think something that is another misconception is people think, oh, this is a result of policy failure. A lot of this is actually the result of policies doing exactly what they were intended to do, which is to marginalize and exclude communities and place these burdens on certain people. Um, so I think that is primarily what has led to a lot of the patterns of inequity in the Deep South.
No, I really love how you touched on that. And I don't think like most people understand how policies work or what they're intended to do. Um, but the fact that the way you just stated it that way, so I'm hoping like for all you viewers that are listening to, start advocating, going out. being involved in projects and programs in your community, talking to your local legislators um, about the work that's being done, and research a lot, and vote. You guys need to vote because your voice does matter. And then also too, so like your work, the intersection of science and policy, I want to touch on. So why is it critical for researchers to engage in policy and diplomacy spaces?
Yes. So I think scientists are really uniquely positioned to have this impact on society by informing evidence-based decision making. We have tools to ask rigorous questions and test hypotheses. And it's important that the findings that we have from those experiments, from this data, doesn't just stay in closed academic journals or stay circulated within other academics. We need to recognize that science in itself can be a tool for public service, and we have an obligation to the public to make sure that it is serving the communities that it needs to reach. And so I think right now we're recognizing that the modern scientist has a lot of different pressures that may look even different than it did 20, 30, 50 years ago, because we are in this public eye and we have these opportunities to weigh in on different policy issues. Um, so things like climate change, for example, we need to make sure that we have the best data available to guide what we will fund in order to make sure that communities can equitably move forward and live healthy lives. We saw that with the pandemic of making sure that the best, not only was it important to develop a vaccine, but we also needed to guide where different interventions and what type of policies should be in place to protect as many people as possible. And so I think right now there's a huge need for scientists to be cross-trained, where we are not only being rigorous in the laboratory and collecting this data and learning how to write and ask questions, but it's equally important for us to engage with our communities. Because like I mentioned, it's important that communities are informing the research questions that we're asking to be as relevant and as translational as possible. Because even if we come up with a solution, if there's not community buy-in and there's not reliable, trustworthy communication, then that solution is not actually going to be implemented in a efficient or equitable manner.
No, definitely. And I think it's really important that we are involving the community within the process, and whatever that process may look like, if that's focus groups, if that's going out and, you know, being involved with them, and not just saying, okay, well, we're going to do this project, we're going to fund this, and this is how you should accept it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's been a problem within, healthcare, public health, pharmaceuticals, everything, policy, just how been kind of going about it in that uh, corporate level realm. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, I love the way that how you put that out there like that. And also, so like what role can health policy intervention play in protecting communities from environmental harm?
Yes. So right now there is a really big push for cumulative impacts legislation. So the way that different industries are permitted, there's a push to look at the community of where that would be automatic, where that would be located and what's already there. So what I mean by that is right now there's say that there's a facility that is an air pollution polluting air what am I saying? Sorry. There is an air polluting facility. And then another facility wants to come in. And even though it's not necessarily polluting PM 2.5 or sulfur dioxide, maybe it's polluting the water, that community is still going to be sited in next to two now industrial facilities. And so I think there's a need right now to look beyond just what is the air quality alone or looking just at what the water quality is alone, and also recognizing finding a way to measure what is this community being exposed in totality. And so there's a really big push. It's a field called exposomics, or looking at the human exposome, or the cumulative exposures that someone experiences throughout the life course. Because we don't just experience air pollution in a vacuum. We don't just experience water pollution in a vacuum. We don't experience, food deserts in a vacuum. These are all things that are culminating to impact our health. And so with cumulative impacts legislation, it's trying to make sure that facilities are not going to be moving into these already overburdened communities. And I think something that is important to be said is whenever we're talking about environmental justice, it's not just a matter of we're not trying to just redistribute of like, okay, everyone gets a landfill or everyone gets, a polluting facility. Environmental justice is about abolition of these hazards and eliminating these harms to begin with. So rethinking different systems so no one has to be exposed to, having PFAS in their water or having their children poisoned by lead. So looking at health policy interventions, I think it's trying to be strategic and creative about making sure that we're eliminating these exposures to begin with.
No, I love that. And especially touching on the landfills. Um, those are very, very dangerous. And we do need to put some policies in place to eliminate that. Um, but I also want to touch on your leadership experiences because
Hmm.
Rose is an exceptional leader out here. So you volunteer with Project Short, Deepen Penn STEM, and Farm for Good. So why is mentorship and representation in STEM so important to you?
Yes. I have been so extraordinarily fortunate to have an endless stream of great mentors throughout my academic career. Starting in high school, I had an amazing science teacher, Mr. Irvin. If you are listening to this, you know who you are. And that really was what pushed me to go into the scientific field to begin with. He was the first person who invested in me, who believed in me, who encouraged me and fostered this interest, and is someone that I still keep in contact with as a fourth year PhD student right now. And then that continued into college, where I had great graduate students who were extremely patient with me, who took time to read through my application essays, who spoke with me very honestly about what it is like to be a graduate student, because it's not always very glamorous. And really, I view this as my way of paying back what other people have invested in me. And I also recognize that it was I was hugely fortunate to have all of these positive influences because I've also seen how having a bad mentor can really sour the taste in your mouth about science. And I think it's really important that we recognize that we need everyone in science. We have so many big problems. We have no shortage of problems and no shortage of work that needs to be done. And by embracing unique identities and unique experiences, that's where the really creative and impactful science comes from. So I've really been fortunate to be part of a variety of initiatives that are trying to increase equity and inclusions in STEM. So prospective graduate school applicants can receive support through Project Short, where they're matched with current graduate students to provide one-on-one support with their essays, with their interview prep, with selecting programs. Because higher ed has so much hidden curriculum in terms of how do you know what schools to apply to? How do you know what questions to ask during interviews? And a lot of this is just passed by word of mouth. And so there are a number of initiatives that are trying to increase equity and access to different types of resources, because sometimes something that's as easy as having access to someone's past application materials can make a huge difference, because sometimes they're looking for a certain type of format or a certain type of layout of how you're conveying the information, that if you've never seen that before, there's no way that you're going to magically know what they're looking for. Um, so I've been really fortunate to be part of graduate school application programs like that. I also enjoy speaking with younger groups. So recently we worked with Upward Bound, which is a first generation low income, a college preparatory program for students from first generation low income backgrounds. And we hosted our first reverse science fair. And through this, we trained graduate students how to speak to an age-appropriate audience of, 14 to 18-year-olds. And we helped them make simplified posters of their research. And then we trained the high school students how to judge a scientific poster. So we gave them a rubric and we let them loose on a scientific poster session. And the goal of this was to really empower the high school students to ask questions, to recognize that they were the ones that were critiquing the grad students now, so they could ask them whatever they wanted. And it was also an exercise in science communication for the graduate students. So things like that, just to increase exposure to STEM careers, give them access to seeing for the first time what a laboratory looks like, if they want to go on a lab tour, have a mentor talk to them about what different pathways look like in science. So I've really enjoyed being part of these different types of initiatives.
No, I love that. And I also want to touch on too how important it is for folks to have a mentor, and not just a mentor, but also a sponsor as well, because there is a difference between mentorship and sponsorship. And, sponsorship is someone that is advocating for you in a room that you cannot get in.
Mhm.
So it's so critical, especially like as you just in higher academia, it's very hard navigating the space. And there's so many different ways that you can go with your doctorate degree.
Mhm.
Whether that's teaching, whether it's being a scientist, being a professor. There's different levels in academia. Do you want to be a dean? Do you want to be a chair? You know, like there's so many different like levels and ways of navigating leadership.
Mhm.
But that all starts with when you start the process in the beginning, before you even submit your application,
Mhm.
having a mentor
Yes.
that I think will really change your trajectory. And like you said, if you have a bad mentor, that could throw a bad taste in your mouth, about this pathway that really is for you and
Mhm.
going to do a lot of good in the future. It's just so important to have mentorship. Um, but I just love how you're involved in all these different organizations and how they all intersect and intertwine into the work that you're doing. Um, so also too, like how can institutions better support students from underrepresented backgrounds who want to pursue environmental health and science careers?
Yes. I think the mentorship piece that you just described is so critical. I think it's one thing to have an advisor who's providing you feedback on your research, which is very important. That is, the primary responsibility that you have as a PhD research graduate student is conducting research in a very rigorous way, learning how to ask questions, learning how to analyze data and process your results, and also writing. So there are a lot of obviously research skills that you need that advisor for. But I think also recognizing you need a mentor for all of these other career aspects. There are a lot of soft skills that you need. So learning how to navigate these rooms, like you mentioned, learning how to bump elbows or how to ask different types of questions at different types of your career. And I think also recognizing there are other things that fall into training. So, for example, being knowing how to teach. That is a skill in itself. A lot of times people are thrown in a classroom and maybe they don't have formal instruction in what the best approaches are for working with undergrads or working with graduate students, the best way to design an exam. So I think recognizing that a lot of these things that sometimes I think academics kind of take for granted of like, oh, well, we'll just throw you in and you'll just know how to do the thing. A lot of these are acquired skills, knowing how to be a good mentor, knowing how to be a good teacher. And then a lot of the other soft skills that I mentioned earlier, or I also technical skills of being in a policy space. If you want to be a policy advisor, what does that pathway look like? And so I think in terms of your question of how can institutions best support people pursuing these careers, I think recognizing that training itself can be very broad and it doesn't always mean these metrics of success that academia primarily values that don't always translate well to a community context or community impact. So things like publications, for example, or grants. Yes, those are important in academia, but if you're working with a community that is living fence line to a food superfund site, they don't care about the impact factor of the journal that your most recent study was published in, or they don't care about your H index because it's not a metric that is relevant to community impact. So I think recognizing that these scholarly contributions can take a lot of forms, and sometimes it's organizing a program or it's organizing a mentoring system for students. um, I was really fortunate to be part of a variety of training opportunities that weren't directly related to my research per se, but I learned how to engage in policy advocacy. I learned how to meet with my congressional representatives. And I feel really fortunate that my mentor was really open-minded to me pursuing these because they didn't directly relate to my thesis per se, but they do relate to my career and also inform the type of path that I'm going to pursue afterwards. And unfortunately, a lot of institutions don't have rigid structures or protections to have this protected time for graduate students to pursue these type of opportunities. And a lot of these training avenues are developed by the students themselves. So two of the groups that I'm now part of, the Penn Science Policy and Diplomacy Group and the Scientist Network for Advancing Policy, are two examples of graduate student-led training programs because they weren't able to receive those skills in other places. So, for example, the Penn Science Policy and Diplomacy group, we do a how to write a policy memo, or how to meet with legislators. We talk about science diplomacy careers. We take students to DC to go to different embassies and talk to science diplomats and learn about different types of fellowships. Because if that organization didn't exist, a lot of that career development just wouldn't happen. And same thing with the Scientist Network for Advancing Policy, where that's actually a coalition of graduate student organizations across the country that coalesced at the beginning of this year, actually, which feels crazy because it feels like we've been operating now for a lot longer than that, than 10 months. But earlier this year, especially with a lot of the actions perpetrated by the Trump administration, there were a lot of people asking, okay, what can we do? And a group of students at Cornell had this idea to organize something called the McClintock Letters. And they were named after Barbara McClintock, who is a Nobel laureate, and she was a geneticist. And the idea was for scientists to publish op-eds in their local hometown newspapers, because we saw this year in the limelight how much there is uncertainty, mistrust, miscommunication between scientists and the public. And we really wanted to repair that relationship. And so the way they went about doing that is organizing different scientists to write to their hometown newspapers with the hopes of opening that line of communication. So they recruited, I want to say 600 scientists, and then they trained 300. And I want to say over 200 letters that were published in their hometown newspapers in June. And since then, that has been a springboard for a variety of other initiatives. So we had, I want to say, 54 groups of scientists meet with their congressional representatives in 26 states during the August recess this year. And then now the group has moved on to a variety of different initiatives, such as organizing an open source science policy course, a science diplomacy course, organizing a science policy hackathon. So it's interesting that there's so much momentum and it's so much synergistic energy, and it's a great space to be part of. But I think it also speaks to how much there's an interest and a need for it, and how rapidly trainees can mobilize in response to things. But I also think it speaks to the need for more institutional structures, because there does need to be some form of long-term sustainability so students don't burn themselves out.
No, definitely. And I love how you touched on a lot right there. But I just love how you're intersecting policy, because I think that policy doesn't get enough light shed onto it.
Mhm.
And that you're really tying in a lot of like your clinical research into that and translating it. And I just feel like that's like the future. Um, so
Mhm.
like also too, like what responsibility do you feel like scientists have to remain connected to the communities their research is meant to serve?
I think that's one of our primary responsibilities. I think what a lot of people don't realize is a lot of research, especially health research, is government funded from the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, and the NSF, which is the National Science Foundation. So a lot of this is taxpayer funded, and I think we have an obligation to communicate that research to the public and to be um, open about what we do. And I think recognizing that scientists come from communities, and it's important that we communicate that back to the communities that raised us. And I think it's challenging because, like I mentioned, a lot of these skills of teaching and mentoring, those are acquired skills that you learn through experience, through coursework, through other forms of learning. And same thing with science communication. That's a muscle that needs to be exercised. Um, it's one that I'm certainly still learning how to exercise, but that type of science communication with humility, I think, is also really important, because you want to make sure that you're maintaining an open dialogue and it's not just talking at someone on Thanksgiving dinner. Like, you want to recognize that everyone is an expert in something, and someone else may be an expert in something that's different than you. And that something may not be transgenic mouse models or may not be cell culture, but their expertise is also valued, and recognizing the type of reciprocity that can have from those types of open dialogue.
Yeah, and I think it's really important that we are being transparent. Like as you said, a lot of these are taxpayer dollar funded projects and programs, and we need to make sure that the communities are understanding what's being done, especially when they are the population that we're using and gathering the data from. Um, So I feel like it, like you said, it's really important that we are sharing that with them and not keeping a lot of the research that we do closed on the journals because a lot of times I even, talked about this a lot. Folks are not looking at the journals. They are not
Mhm.
reading the journals. The ones us that are writing it are reading those journals and we're using it. So
Mhm.
finding ways that we can translate that so they can understand what's being done and what has been written about the issues that they're going through on a daily basis. Um, so also too, as a woman in science and public health, how do you navigate leadership, advocacy, and research spaces simultaneously?
Mm. I have been really fortunate that most of these spaces have been pretty welcoming. Um, I think one of my friends described it as a lot of science policy is a lot of nerdy do-gooders. And so that's one of the things that I love about the public health spaces is that at the end of the day, like a lot of these people are, we want the same thing. We want a healthy and equitable and just world. But this is not to say that I have been free of the icks and the isms, and there have been, you know, plenty of pale male and stale spaces where I've felt, a bit more uncomfortable. But I think recognizing that, I guess, finding the spaces that I identify with and whose vision I align with. So spaces like the Penn Science Policy Diplomacy Group, the Scientist Network for Advancing Policy, those have been two communities that I have found a lot of strength in. I've really enjoyed learning from them, and I feel very inspired and moved by them. Um, I think it's been interesting learning how everyone who is an environmental scientist isn't necessarily always focused on equity. And, people who are, every toxicologist isn't necessarily looking out for best for in a health equity lens. And I think that's been something that's been really fascinating to me is how, there can be people who are discussing climate, but they're not necessarily focused on climate justice, or they're not necessarily focused on public health outcomes. And I think recognizing that is important so we can continue making this conscious effort of, equity and justice aren't things that just happen passively. Like whenever we're discussing study design, whenever we're talking about program implementation, it's important that we are continuously and consciously applying that in a very intentional way, because I have seen a lot of people who are in the climate space where they're interested in climate VC, which is venture capital. They're interested in the climate finance side, not necessarily in a lens of mobilizing finance toward climate justice, but more on the finance and investment side, which not to say that finance is inherently evil, but I think recognizing we do need to be intentional in how we're applying this language and in these spaces. So I think, yeah, finding community, and I think also continuing to be conscious of how we are pursuing the work, especially in a public health radical lens.
No, definitely. And I think it's really important like that you're doing all these different things at once. Then you'll definitely see the fruits of your labor like down the line. Because you didn't just focus on one thing. You said, I'm going to do all these different things because they all work together. And they do, especially when you're in academia. So what advice would you offer young women interested in environmental health, climate, science, or policy work?
Mm. I think recognizing that there are a lot of ways to achieve the end goal and being as open-minded as possible to what those opportunities may look like, because it'll change and morph over time. And you can't perfectly map out what that will look like because information will become available to you over time. So one of my mentors once said to me to think about your career as a play of many acts. And so even if you have broad interests, it's possible to pursue all of them, but maybe you're doing them in a different sequence of events. So maybe Act One looks a certain way, and then a different opportunity arises. Act Two looks a different way, but it can all be part of the same play, and it can all be going toward the same kind of North Star, so to speak. So for me, for example, I started out as a chemistry major, and I thought I wanted to be pre-med. And then I took a public health route. Now I'm in a mouse lab doing mouse lung research, and I'm hoping to go back into a policy space. And so, even though this isn't necessarily exactly how I thought that my educational path would look, would unfold when I was a freshman in college, I still never wavered from pursuing environmental health or environmental justice. And I think recognizing that you can pursue that a lot of different ways is what will ground you the most. Um, the other thing that I think back to a lot in terms of public health is a quote by Angela Davis, where radical simply means grasping things at the root. And so I think, regardless of what you pursue, thinking about the root causes of injustice and the context that the problem exists. And so there are a lot of different ways to continue working toward that vision. And it's okay if what that actual path looks like changes over time.
No, I love that. And I think it's important, like you said, there's many different pathways that you can choose and that you can do it. You can do it. You can persevere and push forward. And like I think also too, like we talked about earlier, mentorship, getting a mentor and not stopping at a mentor, but also getting a sponsor, somebody that if you can see yourself in that role in the future, that they can kind of take you under your wing and, help you navigate those spaces, bring you in, open that door that you can't open for yourself. Um, it is really important because it gets very hard as you're navigating, doing schoolwork and your dissertation and then trying to go to conferences and network and as you're coming up on like you know your later years of your doctoral program and figuring it out, so definitely starting off strong, I feel like is really like critical, so I loved how you touched on all that, and also looking ahead now, what kind of impact do you hope that your work will have on environmental health outcomes and policy?
Yes. So I am currently in my fourth year of my PhD. So hopefully we'll be wrapping up in the next few years.
Yes.
I would love to do a postdoc, which is a research fellowship that people do after they do their PhD to continue developing as an independent scientist and begin thinking about the programs that they may want to pursue as their career. So for me, that would be doing more inhalation toxicology. So thinking about how the things that we inhale impact our health. And so I would love to continue being at this intersection of sex and gender, thinking about both biological sex and then also gendered exposures, and then also what we inhale. So that would be my dream. I'm also open to the fact that life is long and strange, and I would love to be in a policy space at some point. So whether that is being in a policy advisory capacity, whether policy is my day job or it's something that I continue pursuing as an academic, I think as long as I am in a position where I can continue doing a lot of the things that I like, which are teaching, mentoring, building community, helping communities build capacity, informing policy using the best data that we have available, I would be happy as a clam. So I think I'm trying to be as open-minded as possible about what that looks like.
No, I love that. And you are going to wrap it up. It is coming to an end. So I am really excited for you and your journey as you're coming to like this next phase. It's and I think as you like, I know you probably couldn't even like fathom like where you are now and as you have worked through all these years and it coming towards, a close, but it's beautiful because then there's all these other opportunities that are going to present itself to you. Um, so like also too, if you could redesign environmental health policy from the ground up, what values would you center?
Mm, let's see. So I think maybe this is a cop-out answer because I'm using something that's already been invented. Robert Bullard, who is considered the father of environmental justice, he talks about two paradigms. One of them is the environmental justice paradigm, and then one of them is the environmental protection paradigm. And so the environmental protection paradigm is focused on cleanup. So something bad has already happened. How are we going to fix this? And that's the way a lot of environmental policy happens in the US right now, where something already bad has happened. We have to deal with it because it's already happened. Whereas with the environmental justice paradigm, it's like I said, the abolition of harm and preventing things before they happen and thinking about these structures in a way that minimizes or possibly eliminates the type of hazards that can exist. And so we see this manifest in a lot of different types of chemical exposures. So, for example, a lot of endocrine disrupting chemicals that are synthetic and are now ubiquitous, so they're found everywhere, and we're now realizing have a lot of negative health effects. We're now in this question of, okay, well, what do we do? Everyone's been exposed. We're still uncovering a lot of the issues that are being had, and they're also still in mass production for a lot of different types of industry. So how are we going to regulate it? And how do we even begin to approach this kind of mammoth of a problem? And so that's an example of where the problem's already been set in motion. Now we're kind of scrambling to try to figure it out. So I think if I could redesign things in this ideal way. I think centering community concerns and also having more of this precautionary principle of recognizing that we need to be as thorough as possible about how we're evaluating things and their potential impacts before we let them loose on the market. And that's an issue that we've seen a lot now with different environmental chemicals that we're now exposed to. So I think centering community concerns and also centering environmental justice in terms of how we're preventing these harms from occurring to begin with.
No, I love that. And that like really ties into my next question. What message do you want communities that are most affected by environmental harm to hear today?
Mm. Yeah, this is an interesting question because I don't know if I'm necessarily qualified to have a message to the communities because if anything, I should be the recipient of what the communities have to say to the scientists. Um, I can say, my career goal is to direct an academic center to support community university partnerships where communities can have leadership in terms of study design and also policy outcomes. Because a lot of academic research, the outcomes don't serve the community. They don't care if you have a publication at the end. They don't care if it gets you a fancy promotion or if you have tenure or not. So I think we need to reevaluate a lot of these metrics of what is the policy outcome and also recognizing that those timescales for change aren't always congruent with the academic metrics or the academic currencies of conference publications and awards. So I guess in terms of what I would say to communities is, scientists have a lot to reconcile. We've caused a lot of harm in a lot of ways. If we look at the Tuskegee syphilis trial, we've done a lot previously and ongoing to earn this distrust. So I think that there is a really large responsibility for scientists to repair that in whatever context it may look like. So whenever we're talking about doing community engaged research, we need to acknowledge these histories and ongoing histories and legacies of scientific colonialism, of scientific racism, and take a responsibility to be better.
No, definitely. And I think it's like really critical important, like how you said, like we have a responsibility. And we have to use that, whatever our skill set is, whether that's doing the research, whether that's policy, pushing for that, collaborating with others to ensure that the work is getting done and it's getting done on behalf of the community members. Not what we think that we need to do just because we're getting funded to do it, but actually doing that work and translating it to actionable results for them. I think is really important. So I love how you tied that all into together. And then also too, how can listeners stay connected to your work and support environmental health and justice initiatives?
So in terms of how to stay involved with environmental health and justice, I think one of the things that one of the SNAP members, the Scientist Network for Advancing Policy, one of the members said is science policy doesn't need to be that deep. I think sometimes we perceive policy as being this black box of like a really high barrier to entry, or like you have to know how to speak or think a certain way in order to get into policy, or like, what does a policy career even mean? I think recognizing that we can all participate in the policy making process in our own ways. So whether that is things like voting, speaking with your elected representatives, canvassing, speaking with your community members, but I think also recognizing that participating in environmental health and justice is a lot of community care and a lot of mutual aid. And even though, sometimes people think of, oh, like environment, I have to be like planting trees. Like, yes, community gardens are a component of that, or like, community cleanups are a really big part of that. But I think recognizing there are so many ways to care for the people in your community and your neighbors. Things in climate justice can include things of like during a heat wave, checking on an elderly neighbor to make sure that they have, water or the groceries that they need, or participating in mutual aid if someone has a specific need that you can participate in. And it doesn't need to be in a monetary way either. If there are services that you can provide, whether it's childcare or whether it's a specific expertise that you have or a skill. So I think participating in this type of community cohesion is, I think, an underappreciated way that people can engage indirectly with policy, but also directly with environmental health and justice. And for communities that are fence lined to these facilities or are experiencing these types of injustices, this isn't necessarily new information. They've already been doing this. But I think for a lot of people who are interested in getting engaged, sometimes it can feel like it's this very high barrier to entry of like, oh, I have to join a specific organization or I have to, do or say a certain thing. But a lot of it is just looking out for each other. But in terms of elevating that impact, I think there are ways to find other communities. So, for example, early career scientists. If you're interested in joining the Scientist Network for Advancing Policy, let me know. We also have a website. If anyone is in the Philly area and you're interested in collaborating with the Penn Science Policy and Diplomacy Group, we're always looking for ways to platform people's work, especially in the policy space. So whether it's hosting you as a speaker or as a workshop session, we're happy to do that. Um, but I think also if anyone, I don't have a website right now, but I guess if anyone is interested in reaching out, I'm always happy to help people who are maybe in the earlier stages of graduate school. So whether it's applying for fellowships or if you are, a college student and you're interested in going down this path, I'm always happy to share what my experience has been, if there's any way I can be of help. Um, but I think recognizing that everyone interfaces with environmental health in one way or another. And starting local is what I always advise people. So identifying what the local hazards of concern are, looking up if there are local Superfund sites or what the major facilities are, what the histories are, and being respectful of the people who have already been facing these and have been organizing around these, and then identifying ways that you can connect with them and help amplify their work.
No, I love that. And also, I wanted to add to that a little bit. LinkedIn. Rose is on LinkedIn. We love LinkedIn. If you guys don't know, I love LinkedIn. I do love LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn 24/7. So please connect with Rose on LinkedIn because she's doing amazing work. And then you could see everything that she's doing and staying up to date, what she's doing within the community. So I just also wanted to say, Rose, thank you so much for your commitment to science and just the service of people, your dedication to environmental justice, and your vision for the future where health is not determined by zip codes, geography, or political neglect. Your work reminds us that environmental health is not separate from public health, it is public health. And when science, policy, and community come together, real change becomes possible. So, to our listeners, if today's conversation resonated with you, visit angelsprotection.org to learn more about our projects and programs and advancing environmental awareness, health education, and leadership opportunities for young women. And always remember the environment shapes our health, our voices shape our future. So let's keep breaking the silence together. Thank you.
Thank you.